latter part right now of the 7 I Ams of John. Last service we had Brother Vladimir spoke about Jesus, the Good Shepherd, and it was powerful, it was good stuff. And we're going to carry on with that sermon series. We're up to number 5 of these 7. Number 5 is I am the resurrection and the life. And how it works is that 7 times in the book of John, Jesus says, I am, and he makes a statement about who he is. And through studying these things and exploring them, we try and learn more about who Jesus is and then what that means to us and how we can apply that in our lives. And like I said, we're all the way up to number 5. And this one is I am the resurrection and the life. And this is about a story of a man Jesus knows and loves by the name of Lazarus. And Lazarus, he's got 2 sisters that are Mary and Martha. So Fady was talking a little bit about Mary and Martha a little bit ago. We're gonna look a little bit more into. Yeah, that's the working of the Spirit all the way. So we're gonna look a little more into that, and just to give a background on the story. The previous service we had was Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. And I am the good shepherd comes hand in hand with I am the gate of the sheep and I am the light of the world. And in these, they're all about the story where Jesus heals a man who was born blind. And people can't take it. They're like, hey, we can handle that a man was healed from blindness. But the fact that he was born blind, that had never been done before. And then at the end of these I am statements, Jesus starts saying some things about him and the Father and who he is. And the people are so mad that they're ready to seize him, that they try and take hold of him so that they can kill him. And Jesus and his disciples, they barely escape with their lives. And that leads us into the death of Lazarus. Amen. So John chapter 11, and I'm gonna kind of read through the story and just kind of do a verse by verse so that we understand just the story and then what's going on here. So they just ran for their lives and got to a new part. They crossed the river, they crossed the Jordan, and they're in safety now. Like they don't have to fear for their lives at this point. So verse 11 of John says, now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus was now sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, saying, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Jesus is talking to his disciples. It says, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Now, oftentimes people think that they can move the hand of God. Like some people are so close to God and they spend so much time in prayer that they're confident that they can control God. They can make God do whatever they want him to do. They can make him go where they want him to go and when they want him to go. And right now, Jesus kind of establishes that he stays 2 more days, essentially saying, you know what, I'm going to go on my time. Okay? Then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. This is the place where they just came from, where they had to flee for their lives. Verse number 8, but Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you were going to go back there? So his disciples don't want to go. They're like, no, this isn't a good idea. We've been following you for close to 3 years now, and you've done some really cool things, but we really could have died, is what they were saying. So Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light. After he said this, he went to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought that he meant natural sleep. So Jesus is talking, and he essentially says he's dead, but he's talking about like his soul is sleeping, this soul sleep state. And his disciples are like, great, we don't have to go back, because if he's sleeping, he's going to get better. And Jesus is like, okay, you don't get it, he's dead. So they're all, oh, okay. Going down to verse number 14. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. So you really get the sense of what his disciples are thinking. They're all, not only are they outspoken about not wanting to go, now they're like, great, he's dead, we're going there so we can die too, because we're just going to die with him, because if we go back to that place, that's the only thing that's waiting for us there. And it's interesting to note that the first time Jesus is going into Judea, he makes these statements of like, it's not my time. And they enter and they go into Judea, and he heals a man who was born blind. And they do this great work, and they barely escape with their lives. But when he says it's not my time, he knows like he can carry on with his ministry. But at this point, for the one that he loves, he goes into the face of complete danger, to the point that his disciples are scared for their lives. They're sure that if they go there, they're going to die too. And what's interesting is that the next story after this one leads us right into the triumphant entry. Meaning, when Jesus has his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, he enters the last week of his life. So essentially, Jesus is going, because the one that Jesus loves is sick, he goes into this danger knowing what he's going to face, knowing what waits for him, knowing that he himself will be giving up his life, and the very thing that brings him to the point of his ultimate fate and what he came in the world to do was the fact that somebody that he loved was sick. That he goes into that danger because somebody he loved needed him. Verse number 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. All right, so he arrives in town, and upon arriving, he finds out that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. It's a big deal that he's been dead for 4 days because the teachings of the rabbis in Jesus' day, there was a common teaching that if a person died, their soul or their spirit would hover near the body for 3 days. That the spirit would stay there next to the body for 3 days, just in case. But after 3 days, death was known to be irreversible. That after 3 days, there's going to be nothing that can be done for that person. And you can really begin the mourning on the 4th day. Because on the 4th day, it's final. There's this ultimate finality of death. And it's interesting because if a man can't be resurrected after the fourth day, and the previous story was one of a man can't be healed from blindness if he was born blind. That Jesus does these miracles that intentionally go beyond what they believe God can do. That they had strong faith in God to a certain level. But Jesus goes intentionally to the next level to break their thought process of what God can do. Fady was talking about this story of Mary and Martha. And this story that he was telling us about it kind of gives this competition between siblings. Martha is known as this great hostess who has awesome turkey and knows how to throw down in the kitchen, right? Right? So Martha knows how to throw down, and there's this story that he was telling us that Jesus comes into their house, and Martha's doing all this really good work to be a good host and to prepare a good place for Jesus so that he's comfortable. And Mary doesn't do anything to help out. But she just comes in and she just sits at Jesus' feet. And she does nothing. And so Martha's like, hey, a little hand back here? You know, can we get something going? And Jesus says, hey, you know what? Mary has chosen the better. And it's kind of like this point for Mary, like ding, like in the world of sibling rivalry, Mary has scored this point because Jesus is like, hey, she's chosen the better to sit at my feet. And as Fady was saying, that when a person's at the feet of Jesus, they're just spending their time with him, and they're just gleaming from him and being with him and worshiping him. And Martha's so busy, but in this story, you kind of have to give another point to Martha, right? Because it says, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Skipping down to verse 20, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. So Martha gets up and she goes to Jesus, and Mary doesn't even get up. It could be that Mary's a little bitter. I mean, they both know that Jesus could have healed their brother. They both know that. And Mary doesn't get up. She just stays in the house. And then, verse 21, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So like there's kind of this like, ooh, like, you know, that's true, but that's a little harsh. But then she goes, but I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. And she gives kind of what is like essentially a very politically correct, I don't want to offend you. Because I know if you would have been here, you wouldn't have died. But I know God will do whatever you want. So she knows the right things to say. She's the best host. And she knows how to act. She knows the things to say to get the proper response that she wants. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection in the last day. So there's this idea. See, in Christianity, there's this really unknown or rare teaching. People don't teach on it, kind of mainstream Christianity, and it's like in the last day, like at the end of the world, God will raise up people from the dead, like all these people. And this teaching goes far back into just Jewish teachings too, because Martha is saying that I know in the last days he's going to rise again. And Jesus is agreeing, as in, yes, in the last days there will be this resurrection. And it's kind of this thought as to how far does that teaching go. We know that it predates Jesus, because both of them believed that in the last days. And this is a teaching held strongly by the Pharisees, which are the religious party who are extremely pious and they set the bar for righteousness, but they had rivals known as the Sadducees. They were equally as pious, and they would also fast just as much. But the difference between the two was that the Sadducees did not believe in the end time that there would be this resurrection of the dead, whereas the Pharisees believed it, and now we see that Jesus agreed with that belief. But in this case, Jesus is talking not only about the resurrection of the last day, he's speaking of this up-and-coming great miracle that he's about to perform. Because in verse number 25, Jesus said to her, here it is, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? So this is that statement. This is the number 5 time, the ego eimi, the I am. The fully loaded, power-packed statement that we're waiting for in the book of John. And it's, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? He says. Martha says, yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. Mary. They said, Mary, the teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. Verse 29, when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to mourn there. So Mary's still in the house, and she's going through this mourning process, and you get the impression that Mary and Martha were very well-known people, and their brother Lazarus was well-known, because it says that this great multitude of people came from Jerusalem to comfort and to mourn with them. She's in the house mourning, and she gets up to go because the word is that Jesus wants to see her, and this whole crowd of people gets up, and they think she's going to the tomb to mourn there. So it's not just Mary and Martha, but there's this big crowd. Okay, so verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. She says almost the same thing as Martha. But she cuts out the extra part of, but I know the Lord will do anything you ask. She doesn't go there. This is a hurt woman. Right. And she cuts through the political jargon, these kind words, and she just says the same thing her sister said, but without the nice part. She's all, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. And it's this very cold reaction. And then it says that she falls at the feet of Jesus. One interesting thing that stands out in the Gospels is every time Mary comes into the picture with Jesus, she's at the feet of Jesus. That in the Gospels, you will not find Mary and Jesus without Mary falling at Jesus' feet. And at the feet of Jesus, that's where she lives. That's where she is. If Jesus is around, she doesn't need to cut to the nice part. She's a hurting woman, but she's there to worship. She's hurt. She's lost her brother. And the man that she's there to, and Jesus could have healed him. He didn't even have to die. And so she falls at the feet of Jesus. She appears in Luke 10:39 and again in John chapter 12, verse 3. Every time at the feet of Jesus. So then it says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. So Mary falls at his feet, and she's weeping. The words used to describe her weeping is that she's this wailing, this funeral cry of this heavy, deep, sorrowful cry that comes from deep inside the belly, deep inside the person's soul, this wailing. And not only is Mary at his feet doing this wailing, this crying, but there's this multitude of people who came with her. And all of them are crying. And then it says that Jesus stands there, greatly troubled and shaken. That Jesus is so moved by the heartbreak, by the pain that everybody's going through, that Jesus begins to be greatly moved and shaken. He becomes filled with like this instability, this like he can't really he finds it difficult to compose himself anymore. And he says, where have you laid him? So they said, come and see, Lord. They replied. And then in verse 35, the shortest verse in all the Bible, it says, Jesus wept. Every time Mary's in the story, she's at Jesus' feet. And I don't know that we have another instance where it says Jesus wept or that he was greatly shaken. And here's this woman who falls at his feet, and she's so heartbroken that even Jesus begins to weep, that he cries. And I don't think we see that anywhere else. I guess in the point for Mary or the point for Martha, this would have to be another point for Mary on the other side. And it's interesting because we find that Jesus' heart is so moved. And she doesn't have the necessity. She's comfortable enough in her relationship with Jesus that she doesn't have to say, but I know you can do anything through God. Whatever you want, the Father will give it to you. That I know in the last days you will have this great resurrection. She doesn't have to go through that. She's hurt, and she's comfortable enough with Jesus that she can have a raw relationship with Jesus. That if she's hurt with Jesus, she doesn't hide it. She doesn't have to cover it up. She doesn't have to feel that if she's angry at God, the skies are going to open up and a lightning bolt will consume her because she was angry at God, and how dare she be angry with God? Here comes my wrath. You know, there's just this simple openness with herself and Jesus. And it breaks Jesus' heart. And it makes Jesus cry. Come and see, Lord, they replied, and Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him? You can visibly see Jesus' love for Lazarus. That all of the followers, when looking at Jesus, all remark it, the great love that he has for people, for this man Lazarus, for an individual. And in who Jesus is that Jesus is God, humbling himself to putting on flesh and humanity and entering the world in the most humble of terms. And there's a whole world of people, and it's one individual that just breaks his heart. It's an individual that the crowd say, wow, see how God loved this man. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? There's got to be some in every crowd. The critic. The critic is always going to be there. And so, but in what this does is it ties it into, this is the man who opened the eyes of the blind. This is the man who's done great miracles. And perhaps there's this limitation on what he can do, because we know if he would have got here sooner, he could have stopped him from dying. And it's interesting because back in verse number 4, he says, the sickness will not end in death. It is for God's glory, so the Son of Man may be glorified. And then it says that he waits 2 days. And the story is clear. You know that if he goes straight there, there's no question he's going to do a miracle. And Lazarus will be healed immediately. And you realize that every time Jesus comes across the sick and the broken, he can't take it. That he cannot handle the diseased, the dying, the sick, death, that he fixes it pretty much every time. That he cannot take it, to the point that I heard a sermon one time about why Jesus died first on the cross. Because when Jesus was on the cross, he had 2 thieves on each side. And they were all sentenced to death. And the thought was that had one of the thieves died first, Jesus would have had to raise him up again. That they would have been on Calvary and he would have been going, oh, hold on, and would have raised the guy from the dead. And so for that reason, to prevent that, Jesus died before the thieves. Because that's the level that he can't handle the sick and the broken. And this is God who created the world, and he saw that it was good. And he created man, and he saw that man was very good. That this perfect world and this perfection that he created, and it was so good, and God had this perfect relationship with man, and sin enters the picture, and as man is separated from God, there's this sickness that comes in, and there's death that comes in. But when there's this unifying with God, there's life. And God created man to have this relationship with him, and he can't stand the separation. And the symptoms of the separation are this sickness and this death. And so they know that had he gone to Lazarus sooner, there'd be no question that he would have he would have healed his sickness. But instead, he shows up late. 4 days late, to a point of irreversible death. Amen. Verse 38, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. He's asking them to roll away the stone so that he can see the corpse of a man who's passed away. And there's no doubt that if they move the stone, it's going to stink. It's going to smell terrible. The King James Version, I believe, says, by now there is a stench. NIV says there is a bad odor. But however they say it, you know that if they open it, it's going to stink. I remember I had a friend, they had this freezer in their basement. And they didn't know, but like the circuit tripped or something, and so the freezer wasn't working. And they never used this freezer because they had a fridge and freezer upstairs, and they had stuff put in this one that, I guess, long-term storage or something. If there was a nuclear war, maybe they could have this frozen food that would last a while. So for a long time, the freezer didn't work, and it became room temperature, everything on the inside. So all this meat that was in there became room temperature, and then it became rotten, and it was like terrible, terrible, foul meat just waiting for somebody to open that freezer. And they didn't know that there was anything wrong with it. And the day came when they're all, hey, I'm just going to get something out of the freezer, and they opened it, and they're all, oh, and the smell escaped from that freezer, and it just drenched their whole basement with this scent of like rotting flesh. Like just horrible, like terrible smell was in their basement. And because somebody opened the freezer, and I think they ended up getting rid of the whole thing, like never open it again, like get it out of the house and like just make it vanish because what was inside had gone so far bad that like their basement was going bad because they opened it. But this is only 4 days, but either way, if they remove the stone, there's going to be this rotten, horrible smell. And it goes back to God saying, I'm glad that I didn't go because now you will see my glory. And there's this thought that, how is it that the glory of God, God's most amazing miracles can be performed, but they're going to have to do it with the stench. It's going to happen where there's the odor, where there's the death. But had he got there earlier, it wouldn't have been that big of a deal. The miracle wouldn't have been that great. That sometimes for God to do really glorious things in our lives, we've got to go through some stinky situations. And we have to be in a place where you be like, man, my life stinks right now. That for God to really do great things, you have to be put in a position where something really bad has happened. And you're kind of like, PJ was saying they were going to have a year of miracles like 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And the result was this disastrous year of really bad things that happened. But then God came through on them. But in the end, you're like, I would rather you just showed up early and there was no stench. But to see the really great things of God, you sometimes have to deal with the odor, with the filth. So they're like, roll away the stone. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. Notice the nature of his prayer. Oftentimes we think if we want God to do a great miracle in our lives, we have to really cry. And we have to like pound the carpet and like, God, and yell and like, and just go through this just emotionally distraught. We're like, the veins are like bursting in our foreheads and like we can't talk anymore. And the fact of the matter is, when God's going to do something, there's such a simplicity in what's required. That Jesus doesn't plead with God, and he doesn't like ask him to do this great thing. He's all, God, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. NIV actually says, Lazarus, come out. But like, it's like famous words to say, Lazarus, come forth. And there's this giant mob of people. There's a broken-hearted Martha. And there's a broken-hearted Mary. And there's this giant throng of people who came from Jerusalem. And they're all gathered around. And Jesus shows up, and they know Jesus has done great things. And Jesus goes so far as to ask them to remove the stone. And they're like, it's going to stink. And they're all like, so, you know, other people are going like, ooh, I gotta see this. Like, what is he going to do? And so they remove the stone. He says this prayer. And he says this prayer essentially really for the people that are listening. This isn't even like his like pleading with God. He says this for the ears of all of this multitude of people. And at the end of the prayer, he says, Lazarus, come forth. And I can imagine everybody in the crowd going, like waiting, like, is this really going to happen right now? The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Take off the grave clothes and let him go. There's such a beauty in the miracle. It's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, but at the cost of the stress that they had to go through to see the glory of God. No doubt none of us want to go through that kind of stress. I have the privilege. Jesus said it's later in his Gospels, he said, greater things than these you shall do. And so I've had the privilege of serving under two pastors in a row who have prayed for the dead to be raised from. Am I correct, PJ? Yes. PJ has, and my previous pastor both said that twice. They've been in a situation where they confronted death and they prayed for God to do a miracle. They put themselves in the opportunity for God to do this great miracle. And I personally have never done that. Given the chance, perhaps I will. If I felt like the God was speaking to me, hey, you know what, I'm going to do this miracle. Perhaps then I would step out and give it a try. And I find it so compelling, the level of faith in God, that people, that pastors would give it a try. That they would be willing to test God. Like, you want to do this? Greater things than these we shall do also? Like, let's see, you know? And I actually heard a story of a man named Billy Cole. I I heard this story from a person who heard it from him. He didn't tell me the story, and I wasn't there. So if it turned out years down the road that it wasn't completely factual, I apologize. But the way I was told this story was that Billy Cole he was a big evangelist, maybe like the mid-90s, 80s. He did a lot of overseas evangelism for like Ethiopia when they had big crusades with essentially like millions of people giving their lives to Christ. And there's many great miracles that this man has seen in his ministry. And the story goes that Billy Cole got this call that Sister so-and-so, this lady, Sister Johnson, I guess we'll call her, was sick. And they said, can you come and pray? So Billy Cole gets in his car, and he's driving to Sister Johnson's house. And he hears from the Lord as he's driving. God says, I'm going to heal her. And he's all, praise God, yes. Amen. This is awesome. And he gets there to the house, and the people greet him at the door. And they look so sad. They're all, Sister Johnson just died. Sister Johnson passed away, and the coroner is on his way. And he's all, what? He's all, no, but I heard from God, that you were going to heal her. That God was going to do this work. And the people are like crying, and he said, well, take me to her. Let me see her. And he's in the room, and he ends up alone in the room with Sister Johnson. He's all frustrated with God. And he's all, God, you said you were going to heal her. You said you were going to do this miracle, and I believed you. He started to kind of question things, and he started kind of venting his frustration to God, and he felt like no, you know what? God said he's going to heal her. He's going to heal her, And he's all, Lord, heal Sister Johnson, bring her back, and nothing happened. And he's all, oh, Lord, heal Sister Johnson, bring her back, and nothing happened. And he started to get angry, and he goes, Sister Johnson, get up. And he said that her eyes opened, and she gasped. She's all, this big gasp of breath. And he was all, and apparently the woman was raised from the dead. And if Fady could come and play some smooth jazz on the guitar, that'd be nice. And we all go back to this point where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And we look at the life of Jesus, and he heals the man who was born blind, something they didn't believe could be done. And then he goes to Lazarus, and he resurrects a man who had been dead for 4 days, something that they thought could never be done. And Jesus goes to these levels of being more than what you thought he could be. He does the miracles that they didn't think could be done. And all of these things are done with this thought of, with this brokenhearted love for people. And you may think there's certain things God can do, but God can't love me. Or God can't notice me. God can't see me or my life. There's too many people in this world. And even if there wasn't so many people in this world, I'm just not that special. But God comes down in the ministry and the word for all of those who are here tonight is that Jesus comes into your life and he says, I am the resurrection and the life. If your life stinks, if your life has developed this odor, this foulness, if you feel unloved, you don't come to Jesus with the right words. You don't have to come to him and say the politically correct things. If your life has been hurt, if you've suffered emotional trauma in your life and things have gone hugely wrong, you don't have to say the politically correct thing to Jesus. But you show up to Jesus and you come to his feet and you express that you're a hurt person, that you've been through rough things in life, and it continues to get rough. And had he been there for you when you were 15, had he been there in your life when you were younger, or last week if God had been there for you, but where were you, God? And we find that God weeps for the broken, that the heart of God begins to break for those who suffer. And if you will find yourselves at the feet of Jesus and open up your hearts and tell him the hurts that you struggle with, the doubts that you have, the problems that you face, he will perform a work in your life. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. That he can bring you life. He can start new. He can raise things that you thought were dead. That's who Jesus is. The Spirit of God is in this house. It's in this church building. As hurt as you've been, God knows your struggles. There's a spirit of ministry in the church. Spirit of ministry is one that ministers to people, that reaches out to people and touches their hearts. To be ministered to is to be touched by God. And there's a spirit of ministry. The Spirit of Jesus is in this house. I pray that everybody just bows their heads and begins to fall at the feet of Jesus. Listen for him to give you the words that you needed to hear, the touch that you needed to feel. Put your faith in God. I urge all of us to just fall at his feet and just begin to worship him and just let him do a work in your lives. Amen.
so deep, it's more than I can bear. I stand in your peace, it's overwhelming. I wanna sit at your feet, drink from the cup in your hand, lean back against you and breathe, and feel your heartbeat. This love is so deep, it's more than I can bear. I melt in your peace, it's overwhelming. I wanna sit at your feet, drink from the cup in your hand, lean back against you and breathe, and feel your heartbeat. This love is so deep, it's more than I can stand. I melt in your peace, it's overwhelming. I wanna sit at your feet, drink from the cup in your hand, lean back against you and breathe, and feel your heartbeat. This love is so deep, it's more than I can stand. I melt in your peace, it's overwhelming. I wanna sit at your feet, drink from the cup in your hand, lean back against you and breathe, and feel your heartbeat. This love is so deep, it's more than I can stand. I melt in your peace, it's overwhelming.